The night was like any other at New York University Hospital, a ceaseless hum of motion and urgency. Ambulances lined the driveway, their flashing lights bouncing off the glass facade of the prestigious institution. Inside, the quiet tension was palpable, as though the walls themselves were bracing for the next crisis. Dr. Amara Johnson moved through the hallways with purpose. Her white coat swayed as she quickened her pace, scanning the latest update on her phone. Acute aortic dissection. A life hung in the balance. And every second mattered. As she approached the emergency ward doors, a muscular arm extended in front of her, blocking her path. "Hey, where do you think you're going?" The voice was calm but firm, coming from a security guard whose bulk seemed to fill the hallway. Amara stopped short, momentarily stunned. She glanced up at the man, noting the crisp uniform, the squared jaw. "I'm Dr. Johnson," she said, keeping her voice steady. "There's a patient I need to see immediately." The guard didn't move. His eyes swept over her with a cool detachment that made Amara's skin prickle. "You'll have to show me your ID," he said flatly. Her breath hitched. She reached into her pocket and realized, too late, that her ID badge was sitting on her office desk. I don't have it on me," she admitted, a sharp edge of frustration creeping into her voice. "But I'm the attending surgeon on this case. Please, I need to get through." The guard's expression didn't change. "No ID, no entry," he said, his tone unyielding. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Amara's heart quickened not from the urgency of the medical emergency, but from something deeper, older, and more insidious. Behind her, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed. Dr. Michael Stevens, a colleague she knew well, jogged past, his blonde hair slightly disheveled. Relief flooded Amara. "Mike," she called out, her voice carrying down the hall. He turned, briefly, his eyes flicking between her and the guard. She saw a flash of recognition in his face, followed by something else: hesitation. "Tell him who I am," she urged, the words tumbling out. For a moment, Stevens seemed to consider it. Then he shrugged, almost imperceptibly. "Sorry, I can't help," he said, before continuing down the hallway. "I've got a patient waiting." The air seemed to leave the room. Amara stood frozen, watching as Stevens disappeared around a corner. She felt a deep pang, not just at his refusal to help, but at the casualness of it, the way he'd dismissed her so effortlessly. She fumbled for her phone, pulling up her digital ID and holding it out to the guard, her hand trembling ever so slightly. He studied the screen, then her face, before stepping aside. "Go ahead," he said, the reluctance in his voice unmistakable. Amara pushed through the doors, her legs carrying her down the familiar corridors to the operating room. But the delay had cost her, and she knew it. When she entered, the sterile brightness of the room greeted her, along with the sharp voice of Dr. Robert Thompson, head of the surgery department. "Where the hell were you, Johnson?" he barked without looking up from the table where he was already operating. "I was stopped at the entrance," Amara replied, trying to keep her voice even. Thompson scoffed. "Stopped? Why? Forget how to walk into the hospital after all these years?" His sarcasm stung, but Amara didn't respond. There was no point. She stepped into her role seamlessly, assisting where needed, her mind focused on the patient. Yet, beneath the surface, the moment lingered, gnawing at her. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. In the silent hum of the operating room, as machines beeped and monitors blinked, Amara couldn't help but think about the cost of moments like these, not just to her, but to every life that hung in the balance. Discrimination didn't always announce itself with raised voices or overt hostility. Sometimes, it was a quiet barrier, an unspoken assumption, a hesitation that cost seconds when seconds mattered most. The days after the incident at the emergency ward unfolded in quiet, steady rhythms. New York University Hospital hummed with its usual urgency, an endless parade of gurneys, clipped voices over intercoms, and the faint, antiseptic tang that clung to every corner. Dr. Amara Johnson moved through it all with practiced efficiency, her presence a blend of quiet authority and precise control. Yet, beneath her calm exterior, the moment with the security guard and Dr. Stevens lingered. like a faint bruise that refused to fade. It wasn't just the indignity of being stopped or the betrayal of her colleague. It was the way the hospital itself seemed to carry on, unbothered and unaware, as though nothing had happened. In the days that followed, she told no one. She didn't mention it during morning rounds or in the break room, where laughter and chatter filled the space. The words sat heavy on her tongue, their weight impossible to release. She considered filing a formal complaint, but the idea seemed both daunting and futile. There were rules, of course, policies meant to ensure fairness, but Amara knew how easily those rules bent under the weight of doubt and deflection. Hadn't Dr. Thompson already dismissed her explanation with a scoff? And Stevens, his silence had spoken volumes, louder than any denial could. Amara wasn't naive. She had seen this before, though never so starkly. The quiet, insidious way prejudice worked its way into the fabric of everyday life, creating cracks that only widened over time. It wasn't just about her. It was about something bigger, something harder to name and harder still to change. One afternoon, as she made her rounds, she heard voices from a nearby hallway. Two residents stood huddled in quiet conversation. One voice, young and trembling, cut through the low murmur of the hospital. "I told him I worked my ass off to get here," the voice said, "but he just smirked and said I probably got into med school because of affirmative action. Like I didn't deserve to be here." Amara stopped. The words were like a faint echo, carrying her back to moments she'd tried to forget, moments when her own accomplishments had been questioned, her place in the room subtly undermined. She turned the corner and saw Dr. Tanya Williams, a second-year resident. Tanya's shoulders were tense, her arms crossed as she spoke to another doctor, her voice low but tight with frustration. Amara didn't interrupt. She stood for a moment, her presence unnoticed, and watched as Tanya took a deep breath, her anger giving way to a quiet resolve. It was a resolve Amara recognized all too well, the resolve to keep going, even when the ground beneath you felt unsteady. Later that day, as she reviewed patient charts in her office, Tanya's voice echoed in her mind. Amara sat back in her chair, staring at the stack of papers in front of her. She had convinced herself that staying silent was the best choice. It was safer, quieter, less likely to disrupt the fragile balance she had worked so hard to maintain. But now, that silence felt suffocating. Tanya wasn't just another resident. She was part of a new generation, one that Amara had fought to pave the way for. If she stayed silent now, what message would that send? The realization was quiet but undeniable. Her silence wasn't just her own. It rippled outward, touching others in ways she couldn't ignore. Amara closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. For the first time since the incident, she felt the faint stirrings of a new resolve, one that wouldn't be so easily silenced. The hospital buzzed with its usual energy, but for Dr. Amara Johnson, the corridors felt different now. Not louder, not quieter, just sharper, as though the edges of every interaction had been honed to a finer point. She moved through the day with the same quiet precision, yet her mind churned, cataloging moments she might have dismissed before. A casual joke between colleagues that felt off, a nurse hesitating to follow a junior doctor's orders until a senior confirmed them. The ways conversations shifted when certain people entered the room, alone in the silence of her office. These moments replayed in her mind, not as isolated events but as pieces of a larger, more troubling pattern. It started small. One evening, Amara found herself lingering in the staff lounge after hours, her fingers drumming on the arm of her chair as she built up the courage to speak. Across from her, Dr. Tanya Williams sat hunched over her phone, her usual composure replaced with a rare vulnerability. "Tanya," Amara said finally, her voice soft but steady, "can I ask you something?" The younger doctor looked up, surprised. "Of course." Amara hesitated, then pressed on. "That conversation I overheard the other day about affirmative action. Does that happen often?" Tanya's expression shifted, the surprise fading into something more guarded. "More than I'd like to admit," she said carefully. "Why?" Amara nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of Tanya's words. "Because I think it's time we started talking about it," she said. From that moment, something began to shift. Amara started reaching out to others casually at first, Over coffee or in quiet corners of the hospital. She asked questions, listened, and, gradually, began to share her own experiences. What she found was both surprising and deeply familiar. Each story was different, yet they all carried the same undercurrent, a quiet, persistent sense of being out of place, of having to prove oneself twice over. A nurse spoke of being passed over for promotions despite glowing reviews. A junior doctor recounted a patient who refused to let her touch them. The stories were countless, and each one added another layer to the silent burden so many carried. It wasn't long before these informal conversations grew into something more structured. Amara began collecting the stories, writing them down in a small notebook she kept tucked in her desk. She encouraged others to do the same. "We need to keep track of this," she said one evening, her tone matter of fact. "If we're ever going to change anything, we need to show them it's not just a one-time thing." The response was cautious at first. But slowly, the notebook began to fill. What started as a private log turned into the foundation of something larger, a network of voices, quietly sharing their truths. One afternoon, Amara received a message from Dr. Maria Espinoza, a senior anesthesiologist she rarely spoke to. The message was brief. "Can we meet? I've been thinking about what you're doing." When they sat down in a quiet corner of the cafeteria, Maria spoke with a calm deliberation that reminded Amara of her own approach. "I've been here 20 years, she said, her hands folded neatly on the table. "And I can tell you, nothing will change unless we make them see it." Amara leaned in, listening intently as Maria described moments from her own career, moments that mirrored Amara's. Though separated by decades, we're also focused on keeping our heads down. Maria continued, "And I understand why. But maybe it's time we started looking up." The words stayed with Amara long after their conversation ended. The network was growing, and with it came a sense of cautious hope. Yet, she knew this was only the beginning. Back in her office, Amara opened her notebook and added a final entry for the day. "We are not alone," she wrote, underlining the words twice. She closed the notebook and placed it carefully back in her drawer, her mind already turning to the next step. For the first time in weeks, the weight she carried felt just a little lighter. Not because the challenges had disappeared, but because she no longer faced them alone. The office of Dr. Robert Thompson, head of surgery, was a stark contrast to the rest of the hospital. While the corridors buzzed with movement, Thompson's office was a space of quiet authority. The walls, lined with awards and framed certificates, seemed to announce his importance without needing words. Dr. Amara Johnson sat across from him, her back straight, her hands resting lightly on her lap. She wasn't nervous. Not exactly. Over the years, she'd become skilled at maintaining composure in rooms like this, where power was implicit in every detail. Thompson glanced at the clock before meeting her gaze. "Dr. Johnson," he began, his voice measured, "thank you for coming in. We have something we'd like to discuss with you." Amara nodded, her expression neutral. Of course. She wasn't alone. Sitting beside Thompson were two board members and, to her surprise, a reporter from the New York Times. The reporter, a woman with sharp eyes and a notebook poised, was silent for now, observing. Thompson cleared his throat, leaning forward slightly. "As you know, there have been concerns raised recently about the hospital's culture and practices regarding diversity and inclusion. The board has decided it's time to take more deliberate steps to address these issues." Amara felt the words settle over her. Not heavy but not light either. They were carefully chosen, their edges smoothed for public consumption. "We believe," Thompson continued, "that you would be the ideal person to lead this initiative. Given your reputation and standing within the hospital, you could lend credibility and direction to the effort." Amara blinked, her expression unchanging. She allowed the words to linger in the air before responding. "What exactly would this role entail?" One of the board members, a man with silver hair and an impeccable suit, stepped in. "We're envisioning a comprehensive diversity and inclusion program, anti-bias training, mentorship opportunities for minority staff, and a review of our hiring practices. You would be given the resources to shape and lead these efforts." It sounded ideal on the surface. But Amara wasn't naive. She'd seen too many initiatives launched with great fanfare, only to fizzle out when they became inconvenient. She studied their faces, looking for cracks in their polished presentation. And what authority would I have to implement these changes, she asked. Her tone calm but firm. Thompson shifted slightly in his chair, glancing at the board members. You'd have full support from the administration, he said, though the words felt more practiced than genuine. Amara nodded slowly, choosing her next words carefully. I appreciate the opportunity, but I'd like to clarify a few points. Will I have access to hiring and promotion records? The ability to set policy? And, she paused, her gaze steady, will this position be permanent? Or is it tied to the current wave of public interest? The room seemed to tighten. Thompson looked momentarily uncomfortable, but the silver-haired board member smiled thinly. Dr. Johnson, he said, we're committed to making real change. This isn't just for appearances. Amara let the silence stretch, letting them sit with her scrutiny. Finally, she nodded. I'll consider it, she said, rising from her chair. The meeting ended shortly after. With handshakes and practiced smiles. The reporter scribbled notes, and Amara left the room feeling the weight of their expectations pressing against her. In the quiet of her office later that evening, she stared out the window at the city lights. The offer was a chance to make tangible changes, to give a voice to the network she had helped build. But it also came with risks of being used as a figurehead. A token in a system reluctant to truly change. She opened her notebook, flipping through the pages filled with stories from her colleagues. Their voices, raw and unfiltered, reminded her of the stakes. The next morning, Amara met with Thompson again. This time, her voice was steady and clear. I'll accept the position, she said, but on my terms. I want full access to hiring and promotion records, as well as the authority to implement changes without administrative interference. Thompson hesitated, his discomfort visible, but he nodded. Agreed. As Amara walked out of his office, she felt neither triumph nor relief. Instead, there was a quiet determination, a sense that the real work was only beginning. The first weeks in her new role were a blur of meetings, presentations, and planning sessions. Dr. Amara Johnson's office became a revolving door for ideas and opinions. Some supportive, others less so. The hospital administration had committed to real change. But Amara quickly discovered how easily words could be stretched, twisted, or emptied of meaning altogether. Her days began early, often with a cup of coffee and a notebook filled with tasks that seemed to multiply overnight. Emails piled up faster than she could answer them. Each time she stepped into a meeting room, she felt the weight of expectation not just from the administration but from the colleagues who had entrusted her with their stories. Amara's first initiative was straightforward: anti-bias training for all hospital staff. She introduced it in a board meeting with a carefully prepared presentation, outlining how unconscious prejudice affected patient care and workplace dynamics. The response was measured, polite. It's a good idea, one board member said, tapping a pen against the table. But do you really think this will resonate with everyone? Some people might feel alienated. Amara met his gaze evenly. Change often makes people uncomfortable, she said. That doesn't mean it isn't necessary. The program rolled out within a month. Mandatory for all staff. The sessions were led by an outside consultant, someone Amara had personally vetted. Attendance was high, but engagement varied. Some attendees nodded along thoughtfully. Others crossed their arms and stared at the clock, their expressions making their skepticism clear. Amara observed quietly, taking mental notes. She knew this was only the beginning. Resistance didn't always announce itself outright. Sometimes it lingered in silence, in the absence of cooperation. Meanwhile, she launched a mentorship program aimed at supporting minority residents and junior staff. Dr. Tanya Williams was among the first to join, her enthusiasm tempered by cautious optimism. This is good, Tanya said one evening after a workshop. But will it last? Amara appreciated her honesty. That depends on us, she replied. Not everyone shared Tanya's cautious hope. Rumblings of dissatisfaction began to surface. Subtle at first. A senior doctor questioned why resources were being allocated to new programs when the hospital was already stretched thin. A nurse supervisor complained about the added burden of attending another workshop. And then there was Dr. Michael Stevens. Amara had kept her distance from him since that night in the emergency ward. But his presence loomed larger now. Stevens had been polite, even cooperative, during the early days of her new role. Yet, as the programs gained momentum, his attitude began to shift. It started with offhand comments in staff meetings. "Are we sure this is the best use of time?" he'd ask. His tone light but pointed. "Shouldn't we focus on patient outcomes instead of, whatever this is?" Amara didn't respond directly, letting his words hang in the air. But she noticed how others in the room glanced at him. Some nodding subtly, others looking away. Soon, the resistance became more organized. Stevens quietly rallied a group of like-minded colleagues, framing their concerns as logistical rather than ideological. Emails circulated, questioning the effectiveness of the new initiatives. Residents reported overhearing conversations where Stevens dismissed the programs as optics and a waste of effort. Amara remained calm outwardly, but she couldn't ignore the growing tension. One afternoon, she received an anonymous email with a subject line that read simply, "You're dividing the hospital." The message inside was short but biting. "We don't need your agenda here. Focus on your job and stop trying to change things that don't need fixing." She read it twice, then a third time, before closing her laptop. The words stung, not because they surprised her but because they confirmed what she already knew. Not everyone wanted change, even when it was long overdue. That evening, as she sat alone in her office, she opened her notebook and began to write. She listed the programs that were underway, the names of people who had supported them, and the challenges she was facing. At the bottom of the page, she wrote a single sentence: "Progress is slow, but it's still progress." She closed the notebook and leaned back in her chair, the city lights casting faint patterns on the walls. The work was harder than she had imagined, but she wasn't ready to stop. Not yet. Amara knew the path ahead would be steep, marked by resistance both overt and quiet. But she also knew this: real change was never easy, and the only way to move forward was to keep going. The hospital, as always, moved forward in its unrelenting rhythm. Patients came and went, surgeries began and ended, and lives teetered on the edge of disaster and recovery. To the casual observer, New York University Hospital functioned as smoothly as it always had. But beneath the surface, tensions simmered, unseen by most but felt by those paying attention. Dr. Amara Johnson felt it every day. The weight of resistance wasn't loud or confrontational, it was quieter than that. More insidious. Polite smiles masked disapproval, and carefully worded emails concealed pointed critiques. Michael Stevens, once a background figure in her professional life, had now positioned himself as a vocal skeptic of her initiatives. He never outright opposed her in public meetings, he was too careful for that. Instead, his objections came in the form of subtle jabs, questions framed as concerns, and conversations that sowed doubt among staff. "We need to focus on patient care," he said during one staff meeting, his tone calm but firm. "I understand the intent behind these programs, but I worry they're creating unnecessary distractions." Amara listened without interrupting. She met his gaze evenly, waiting for him to finish before responding. "Improving our workplace isn't a distraction," she said. "It's part of ensuring the best patient care. When people feel respected and valued, they work better. That benefits everyone, our staff and our patients." Her words were met with nods from some, silence from others. Stevens didn't argue further, but the flicker of a smirk on his face told Amara he wasn't finished. Later that week, she heard from a resident that Stevens had been holding informal gatherings with staff who felt disillusioned by the changes. "It's nothing official," the resident said, lowering her voice. "But he's saying things like the programs are unnecessary and that the hospital doesn't have a problem in the first place." Amara nodded, not surprised but deeply disappointed. Stevens wasn't just opposing her, he was undermining the very foundation of what she was trying to build. The tipping point came when an email chain surfaced among several staff members. It contained a list of talking points circulated by Stevens, questioning the necessity of the diversity programs and accusing the administration of catering to special interests. The email was forwarded to Amara anonymously, with no context other than the words, "You should see this." She read the email twice. Her stomach tightening. The language was careful, but the intent was clear. Stevens wasn't just skeptical, he was actively working against her. That evening, Amara stayed late in her office. Staring at the email on her screen, she thought of the months she had spent building this initiative, of the stories her colleagues had shared with her, of Tanya Williams and the younger generation of doctors who looked to her for leadership. She thought, too, of the anonymous threats, the whispered conversations, and the subtle ways her authority had been questioned since the beginning. It was exhausting, but it was also familiar. Amara closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, letting the silence of the room settle around her. She didn't feel anger. Not exactly. What she felt was something quieter but no less powerful, a determination that had grown sharper with each obstacle. The next morning, she scheduled a meeting with the hospital board. When she walked into the room, she carried a folder filled with documentation, emails, reports, and stories she had collected over the months. "This is what's happening," she said, her voice steady. "We're making progress, but we're also facing resistance from within. If we want these programs to succeed, we need to address it openly." The board members exchanged glances, some nodding, others looking uncomfortable. Amara didn't flinch. She had no intention of softening the truth. Not now. As the meeting ended, one of the board members approached her privately. "You're doing important work," he said quietly, "but not everyone will see it that way. Just, be careful." Amara nodded, understanding the unspoken warning. She didn't need to be reminded of the risks. But as she walked back to her office, she felt a quiet resolve settle over her. Resistance, she realized, wasn't a reason to stop. It was proof that change was happening and that it was needed more than ever. The hospital carried on as it always did, its steady hum of urgency masking the quiet tensions beneath. Dr. Amara Johnson kept moving through her days, performing surgeries, attending meetings, and steering her initiatives forward. Outwardly, little had changed, but she felt the undercurrents growing stronger, pulling her in opposing directions. Her new role had become a double-edged sword. While some colleagues openly supported her, others maintained a polite distance. Their silence is more telling than any outright opposition. The weight of leadership was heavy, and Amara had grown used to carrying it alone. It was late one afternoon when everything came to a head. Amara was reviewing patient charts in her office when she received a call. It was from Dr. Tanya Williams. Her voice was steady but strained. "Dr. Johnson," Tanya began, "I think you should know there was an incident in the OR this morning." Amara sat up straighter. "What happened?" Tanya hesitated before continuing. "A senior attending made a comment. He said he didn't trust me to handle the procedure because some people get ahead without earning it." The words hit Amara like a sharp blow. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Did anyone else hear this?" "Yes," Tanya said, but no one said anything. The familiar ache of disappointment settled over Amara. It wasn't just the comment itself, it was the silence that followed it. The tacit approval that allowed such words to linger unchallenged. "Thank you for telling me," Amara said. "I'll handle it." After the call ended, she sat in her chair for a long time, staring at the wall. Tanya's story wasn't new, it echoed so many others she had heard, including her own. But this time, it felt different, more urgent. Amara closed the chart she had been reviewing and stood, her movements deliberate. She didn't call a meeting, didn't draft an email. Instead, she walked straight to Dr. Robert Thompson's office. Thompson looked up as she entered, his expression a mix of curiosity and wariness. "Dr. Johnson," he said, gesturing for her to sit. She didn't. "We need to talk," she said, her tone calm but firm. Thompson raised an eyebrow. "About what?" "About what's happening in this hospital," she replied. "About the resistance to the programs we've implemented. About the comments being made in operating rooms. And about the silence from people who should know better." Thompson leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "I assume you have specific examples." "I do," Amara said, placing a folder on his desk. "This is just a fraction of what I've documented." He opened the folder and began flipping through the pages, his expression unreadable. When he finally looked up, there was a flicker of discomfort in his eyes. "This is troubling," he admitted. But you know as well as I do that change takes time. You can't expect to fix decades of culture overnight. Amara nodded. I understand that, but we're not making progress if people feel free to undermine the work we're doing, or worse, if the administration allows it to continue unchecked. For a moment, Thompson said nothing. Then he sighed, rubbing his temples. I'll look into it, he said finally. Amara didn't feel relief. She had heard those words before, and they rarely led to action. But this time, she wasn't willing to wait. I'm also taking this to the board, she said. They need to see the full picture. Thompson's expression hardened slightly, but he didn't argue. Do what you think is necessary, he said, his tone carefully neutral. As Amara left his office, she felt a quiet determination settle over her. She didn't know what the board's response would be, but she wasn't going to let that stop her. The meeting with the board later that week was tense but productive. Amara presented her findings with the same precision she brought to surgery, laying out each point clearly and calmly. This isn't just about one incident, she said, her voice steady. It's about a pattern, a culture that allows these incidents to happen. If we want to be the institution we claim to be, we need to do more than talk about change. We need to act. The room was silent for a moment before one of the board members spoke. Dr. Johnson, he said, we appreciate your leadership. And you're right, this requires action. After the meeting, Amara returned to her office. Exhausted but resolute, she didn't know if the changes would come quickly or if they would face more resistance. But for the first time in weeks, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time: hope. As she opened her notebook to jot down the day's events, she wrote one sentence at the bottom of the page: silence is complicity. Action is the only way forward. She underlined it twice, closed the notebook, and prepared for the next battle. The hospital looked the same as it always did. Its polished floors gleamed under fluorescent lights, the steady rhythm of activity continuing as though nothing had changed. But Dr. Amara Johnson felt the difference. It wasn't visible, not yet, but it was their subtle shifts that signaled something deeper. Months had passed since her meeting with the board. The diversity and inclusion initiatives had been expanded, and the first signs of their impact were beginning to emerge. Staff were engaging more openly in the training sessions, and the mentorship program had grown, with new participants every month. Even so, the progress was fragile, like the first leaves of spring after a long winter. Amara stood at the back of the hospital auditorium, watching as staff filled the seats. It was a rare moment of pause for her, an opportunity to observe without the weight of immediate responsibility. On stage, Dr. Tanya Williams was preparing to speak. Tanya adjusted the microphone, her movements steady but deliberate. When I first came here, she began, her voice carrying across the room, I thought the only way to succeed was to keep my head down and work harder than anyone else. I thought if I was perfect, I could avoid the doubts, the assumptions, the whispers. She paused, scanning the audience, but perfection didn't shield me, and it didn't protect others either. What did help was realizing I wasn't alone, that there were people who understood, who were willing to stand with me. Amara felt a quiet pride as she listened. Tanya's words reflected a journey that wasn't just hers, it was shared by so many who had walked similar paths. When the applause died down, the hospital's CEO stepped forward to announce the expansion of the diversity initiative. The new measures included a permanent council to oversee equity efforts, a mentorship fund, and mandatory reporting of incidents of bias. Amara had pushed for these changes, but hearing them spoken aloud still felt surreal. The applause that followed was polite but genuine. She knew not everyone in the room agreed with the direction the hospital was taking, but the momentum was undeniable. Later, at the reception, Amara stood near the edge of the room, nursing a glass of water and watching the mingling crowd. Colleagues approached her one by one, offering quiet words of gratitude or cautious encouragement. Dr. Maria Espinoza, the senior anesthesiologist who had supported her early on, approached with a warm smile. You did it, Maria said, her voice low enough to keep their conversation private. We did it, Amara corrected. Maria's smile widened. Fair enough, but don't downplay your role in this. You were the one who refused to let it go. Amara nodded. the weight of Maria's words settling over her. It wasn't pride she felt, more a quiet sense of fulfillment. The work wasn't done, but they had taken a step forward. Across the room, she spotted Michael Stevens. He was speaking to a group of colleagues. His expression as composed as ever. Their eyes met briefly, and for a moment, she thought he might approach her. Instead, he turned back to his group. His words too quiet to hear. Amara didn't feel anger or resentment. She knew Stevens would likely remain a skeptic. Perhaps even an obstacle, but she also knew his voice no longer held the weight it once did. As the evening wound down, Tanya approached her, a tentative smile on her face. "Dr. Johnson," she said, "thank you for everything. I wouldn't be here without you." Amara shook her head. "You would have found your way, Tanya, but I'm glad I could help." The younger doctor hesitated before speaking again. "Do you think this will last?" Amara considered the question, her expression thoughtful. "I think it depends on us," she said finally. "Change doesn't happen on its own. We have to keep pushing. Keep speaking up. But yes, I think it can last." Later that night, as she sat in her quiet office, Amara opened her notebook one last time. She flipped through the pages, rereading the stories, the notes, the moments of doubt and determination that had brought her to this point. On the final page, she wrote, "Change is slow, but it's real, and it's worth fighting for." She closed the notebook and placed it carefully in her desk drawer. Outside, the city lights blinked against the darkness, a quiet reminder of the world beyond the hospital walls. Amara leaned back in her chair, feeling the faint stirrings of hope. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt possible to imagine a future where things might truly be different.